to this week's edition of the Coaching In, which is the fifth episode in a series of podcasts about listening. My name is Shani Crawford, and today we're continuing the listening experiment that started back in May 2024 when Claire Pedrick, master coach and host of the Coaching In, invited Oscar Trimboli, an expert in deep listening, to join her at the Inn for a talk about listening upon my strong recommendation. Episode 2 in this series was a collection of reflections from the audience after they listened to episode 1. Then episode 3 was a very special one for me as I was invited to join the conversation. In episode 4 last month, the three of us came together for a live podcast where the audience was invited to be a part of the conversation in real time. And that brings us to today, episode 5, where the three of us have come together again to explore the world of listening and see where it gets us to today. So with that said, Claire and Oscar, perhaps I can invite you into the listening playground by asking you to share with the audience where you are in your thinking about listening today.
Go on, Oscar.
Thanks, Shani. I think at the moment I'm in a very deep space of research. I'm currently reading the original paper written by Carl Rogers in 1952 about listening. It's a 32-page document. And what you don't know about Carl Rogers, he was good buddies with Abraham Maslow of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow never drew the pyramid, by the way. That was something that the marketing team got a hold of later on and helped to transmit his idea. But one thing you don't know about Carl Rogers, he was called before the McCarthy hearings, or Anti-American Activities Committee, as it was known then, to basically explain why he was listening to the workers. And a lot of the work in the 36-page paper is about listening in the workplace and how to listen to workers. But one of the things that frustrated me about this journey was professor as he became, all his academic writings are now behind a paywall. And you have to pay, or you can kind of cheat the system and speak to somebody who's got access to those university sites. But as I spent at least 20 years negotiating intellectual property contracts on behalf of software companies, I have an aversion to doing that. So eventually I discovered somebody had legally printed it into a booklet, which is the 36 pages I'm reading right now. Apart from writing Python scripts for analysis of share of voice from transcripts of team meetings. That's another thing I'm doing for professional development on my own part. So that's where I'm at, Shani, in my listening journey.
That's so interesting. I want to get into that today. Hear more about that. Claire, how about you? Where are you today?
Well, I've just come back from Spain, where I've been pretty much since we last met. And listening in a space where you are where people are speaking not your second language. I suppose I could gloriously say Spanish is probably now my fourth, but I'm not great. So I think what's interesting about being there was how much it tunes up the listening, because you've got less capacity to understand, but you've got more capacity to hear. So getting the sense of being more important than the actual content of. So I was very proud of myself because our apartment had a drainage issue, which was very unpleasant. And not only did the guy who came, well, he wasn't speaking Spanish, he was speaking Valencian, and very fast. And so I had to go entirely for the visual and the sound in order to be able to understand what he was saying. And the only word that I understood was the one word that really mattered. that means elbow.
Mhm.
So, which was the bit of the drains that had broken, which he was going out shopping to fix. But I think what was fascinating about that was learning again how we can listen when we don't understand and still do some really good listening.
Claire, is that about tuning faces? Is it about the musicality? Which one are you tuning in first and second in that regard?
That's such a good question. Can I go to the impact first? The impact was that everybody thought I spoke Spanish. I think probably tuning into the looking first and then tuning into the sound. But what was fascinating was that we were in a restaurant one evening and I started speaking in Spanish and then they started speaking in Spanglish, a kind of combination of Spanish and English. And in the end, I had to say to her, I can't speak Spanglish to you. I can speak English and I can speak Spanish, but I can't speak both at the same time. Because it was and that was to do with hearing her. It was like I was listening with one way when she was speaking English and with another way when she was speaking Spanish. And when she was speaking both, I don't think my brain knew which bit to tune into. So I just couldn't do it. So it was really interesting. Really interesting.
Can I explore the looking a little more?
Yeah, please do.
So with the looking, where do you start your focus and then where do you diverge your focus when someone's speaking in that context?
So in coaching, I would do it on the eyes, but I'm just now in my cafe in Spain, where I wrote very badly. But I think it starts with the whole. For me, it starts with the whole face, and then except with the plumber when I think it was face and hands. I think it depends on the nature of the conversation, doesn't it, and what you're listening for? Because with the plumber, I was listening for a solution, very urgently. I think what was interesting about the dance of the conversation, the listening. If I think about the person I spoke to the most, who was the guy in the owner of a cafe where I was working. And I have a desperate need to drink a cafe con leche. There was something about the mood of the looking, the because if I try and remember, it was only last week. It was only 4 days ago. But my memory of him is the whole of him. So I wonder whether I was listening, whether I was looking at the whole first.
I'm speculating that 2 of them were listening to somebody standing and one might have been listening to somebody seated.
Yeah. It's different, isn't it?
So it's not only the physicality of the container, its width and its depth and its height, it's also how we're positioned in that container.
Yeah.
Width, depth and height and the relativity of all of that. What's that got you thinking, Shani?
Yeah, that is fascinating. I never thought about the listening being different based on whether the speaker is standing or sitting. And therefore the amount of data that you're able to have access to is quite different, I'm guessing.
and it also allows them to transmit data in a way differently if they're standing versus seated. And equally, how does somebody arrive at a conversation and how do they settle into a conversation? That energy and frequency will also transmit differently to somebody listening, and whether they're tuned into all of that as well. Because I often think of the shape, but not just the shape of the virtual environment, the physical environment, but the relative shapes. And that's not just the physicality of the shape, but it's also where the range in the voice is coming from, or even if there is range in the voice. And I'm just suspecting that if you think about the waves, the height and the distance between the waves, Claire's tuning was different in that Spanglish example compared to English versus Spanish, versus the third one, which was that a dialect or a completely separate language, Claire?
It's a dialect, but it's very strong because I've only ever spoken Spanish in northern Spain. And where they speak Catalan as well. And Catalan and Valencian are quite similar, but the way people speak Spanish in Valencia is really different from the way they speak Spanish in the north. So tuning into that took a few days. Yeah, very interesting. Because I don't... Go on.
No.
Go ahead, Claire.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure that the music is useful until we've sensed the looking. For me, I think the noticing, the visual kind of positions it, and then the sound comes in after.
And I think there's a consciousness for us to think about the difference between practice and mastery. I think in practice, we talk about prescriptions and steps, and mastery is conscious of prescriptions and sequence. That's why I was curious which was first and which was second in that example, because I think until you've mastered the steps, you're not sure what the sequence is. So, for example, in the book, I'm very explicit about hear, see, and sense. They're building on top of each other because that's the way most people are processing their listening. Yet the impact is at the bottom there. It's what do you sense, the state shift and all of that. As something just shifted for Claire, for those of you who can't see, when I said sequence and hear, see, and sense. So I'm curious what you're sensing there, Claire.
Well, I'm always consistent in the way I write about those three words, but I write them in a different order, Oscar. So I write see, hear, sense. Isn't that interesting? And you write hear, see, sense.
Yeah.
And I wonder what that says about us and the way we are in the world. And I wonder whether that's to do... Well, that's a very interesting question.
Yeah. I don't think one is correct or incorrect.
No.
Mine is not informed by my practice, but where people are in my research database about they struggle first with the hearing part of listening, and then they struggle with the seeing part of listening, and ultimately they struggle with the sensing. So mine's kind of a boring response. Mine's driven by the data that I've collected. It doesn't make it right. It just is. So I speculate that yours is informed by many more domains than research.
Yes, I think you're right. I also have a question that I'm living with at the moment, which is how flexible are different people's ways of thinking to being able to notice. And that's a kind of new inquiry for me. But my observation would be that the seeing can be, some people will adapt to seeing once you've noticed it. Once you've said, I wonder what you can see, then they can see it all, or they can see a lot. Other people kind of go, what do you mean? I didn't see that. And I wonder what that says about difference.
Yeah, and I think part of that talks into adult development theory and your ability to be conscious in a higher state of thinking and whole duality versus people who are trying to master one of the elements and go from there. I think, with great art and great music, you need to master the rules so you can break them. And it's in mastering the rules that when you look at Monet and how many lilies did he paint, he painted many lilies in a very literal sense, and then he moved to very different ways of expressing them in the world because he could. So it's an interesting tension there. I'm also conscious we've got a bunch of questions, Shani, from our last conversation that we probably haven't got around to doing, and the difference between hearing and listening is taking action. So I'm just curious if there are questions that are coming in via the chat that we might like to explore for the current discussion, or pick up a handful from the previous discussion as well. But before we do, Claire, had we finished?
Yeah, I think so. Something came to me and it's gone again. Oh, yes. So when you said the thing about mastery is learning it and then breaking the rules, the conversation that's built out of the last session, the last conversation that we had, the biggest exploration has been when you and I both said that when people are venting, we're not listening. And I would say we're being present, but we're not hearing the content. And I would say that that's a really good illustration of what you just said. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, good pickup. And a hat tip to Mark for his very elegant, sophisticated, and well thought through communication. It was a piece of poetry that he wrote that really touched me. So I just want to acknowledge you, Mark, if you're watching, and if you're not, you'll pick it up on the recording like you did last time. But his ability to feel like he was present, even though he's watching a recording, was just so prosaically put together. So thank you.
He's here.
Yes. Oh. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Welcome. Yes, so I definitely would like to invite the live audience to share any reflections or questions that you have. You can share them in the chat. Also, afterwards, if you're listening to this afterwards and you'd like to be a part of this conversation, we definitely want to hear from you as well. And you can email Claire with your questions or your thoughts to share so that we can bring them into the next conversation. So just looking in the chat, Lizzie has a question for us, but she says we've moved on. But let's just have a quick look at her question. So, how does the impact of the online container have on the listening for you all?
For me, I find it easier online because I was always taught that staring is rude face to face. And I think that in the online space, there's something about being able to really notice stuff without the person that you're listening to and noticing, feeling overly self-conscious. Now we're all being a little bit self-conscious, but
sit up straight.
So I think it's different. Yeah, I think it's different. And I often close my eyes when I'm listening online, probably in a way that I wouldn't do face to face.
Which is ironic given our previous conversation from 5 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it means that you're blocking out the visual to get a better sense of things or to hear things.
I wonder whether it's, I had to do it to work it out. I wonder whether it's to do with the moving from the seeing and hearing to the sensing. I'll have to see. I'll have to practice.
Interesting.
What do you think, Oscar?
So here's my caveat. Beware of prophets with false binaries. So let me present you with a false binary, Lizzie. There's online synchronous and online asynchronous. This is synchronous, where we're all in the same space at the same time. And asynchronous is a recording. So you can create containers in both. The real question is, how conscious are you of the container you're creating? You're creating the container online by your lighting, by your background. You're creating a container by the speed at which you speak, how close you get to the microphone, how often you might just whisper to kind of get people to lean in just a little more to what you're saying. So do you choose to stand or do you choose to sit? So two people are choosing to sit and I'm choosing to stand. That creates a different container. So the same thing is true too in an asynchronous environment. Do you choose to share the recording as audio? Do you choose to share the recording as video? Do you choose to share the recording with a transcript? Do you choose to share the recording with the chat? So there are many ways you can create a container in an asynchronous environment as well. And we'll pop onto Mark's question, but Lizzie, I'm curious to get your feedback on that. As what have you heard there that's useful for you, and even better, what have you heard that's completely useless perspective on that as well?
Shall we go? It may take Lizzie a few moments to
type
in.
No, we'll just go to Mark.
Okay, so Mark has said, what about sense, see, hear as a possibility? So that's the order that Oscar mentioned, that people naturally will go hear, see, sense, and will struggle with hear, then struggle with see, then struggle with sense. And they may not, am I interpreting this correctly, that they may not get to see or sense unless they're really working at it. Certain people may not get to the see or sense without active engagement and actively trying to get there. Yeah. So possibly what Mark is saying is well, what do you think Mark is saying? Let's say it.
I'll go first, Claire. I think it doesn't matter. The question you have to ask yourself is, does the order serve the purpose of the dialogue rather than your primary preference? That's irrelevant. Your primary preference should be driven by, if it's a hugely moving conversation about the fact that the person's struggling with a cancer diagnosis and they're trying to figure out how to explain it to their manager at work. Well, I guess hear and see are completely irrelevant in that context. And you're going to stay with sense because you're going to move to what does it mean for you very quickly rather than how are you going to tell somebody? Like, who cares how you're going to tell somebody? But maybe that's how they present. I had a situation 2 weeks ago where somebody was talking about someone on their team that was in that situation, and they came to them and said, "Hey, boss, I don't know how to tell you this," and so there's that. So again, back to when you've mastered the rules, then you break them and you get to an orientation of what's in service of the dialogue, not what's my primary preference. Claire?
I'm thinking about really extremely empathic empaths, and I notice that there are some people who will sense first, and I'm doing some work around it actually at the moment, because there's an English psychotherapist called Nigel Wellings who said, never know first, never know better, never think you know. But there is a certain kind of person who probably do know. So so I'm not sure they think they know. I think they actually do know. I think their sensing is so tuned in, and there's a timing issue for them in the way that they engage in dialogue with others, I think, because that is overwhelming for the person that you're present with if they think that you think that they know.
Yeah, when they sense before you do,
Yeah,
there is a huge perceived power differential.
Yeah.
And if I can't even verbalize what you've felt about me, how can I even dialogue with it?
Yeah. There's a podcast called The Telepathy Tapes that's about non-verbal autistic people and their capacity to communicate deeply non-verbally. And that's on my list of things to. It's very controversial, but it's on my list of things to listen to see what insight it gives here. Yeah, it's a really fascinating one. I would say that for people who have, I think it depends on the unique differentness of the way that your brain functions, probably.
And for Mark and Lizzie in the chat, which bit of that's useful for you or not, both of those inputs will be useful for us.
Claire, do you also have the same? Do you also see people in your practice who think they know and don't know?
Yes.
Who think that they are deep empaths, but it's something that's going on inside of them that they're kind of projecting?
Yeah.
And is that more common or less common, or is it common? I guess that's my question.
I think I found the Nigel Wellings thing. I can remember I was in Wales and somebody had written it down on a post-it note and give it to me and said, I think this might be useful. I go, yes, it's amazing. And I was kind of the mind that I thought that the risk was that we thought we knew and we didn't. But I've got a number of neurodivergent coaches that I'm working with who have a really, really, really strong sense of sensing. And we're in dialogue about the learning. It's interesting, but I think the risk for many people is that we think we know and we don't. And I think it comes from a different place, because I think the think we know comes from our thinking head. And I think that the sensing we're talking about comes in somewhere else.
I've been listening to Eckhart Tolle recently, who is very relevant to this conversation. Actually, just this morning I heard something and I was like, oh, I maybe can bring this up with the podcast today. And it's exactly about this. Would you mind if I read out the quote that I heard today?
Please.
So it's from his podcast. The episode is called Wisdom and Stillness. And he says, as you practice what I suggested here, sense perception without labeling, looking at another human being, or listening to another human being without any judgment in your mind, in that space of open, alert presence, that's the state of not knowing, and yet where true knowing actually arises. That's what we're talking about, right?
We do that in our improv training.
Really?
Mm.
What does that look like?
It looks like two people standing opposite each other,
Mm-hmm.
and one of them thinking something and the other one looking. And then, yeah, one of them has to be they have to be thinking about somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to go, I am a 5-year-old child in a bad mood, or I am a this, or I am a the other. It's just a bit fun, but it is really interesting. I was reading something the other day. Have you read this, Oscar, about there are 8 senses, not 5?
What are the other 3?
I don't know, because it's in my pile. It said there are 8 senses, not 5, and I thought, oh, that needs to go in my pile.
Yeah, there's more nerve endings in our gut than there is in our brain, for example. So when people talk about their gut feel, it's also a metaphor, because our parasympathetic nervous system, which sits around and protects our lungs and our hearts, also is a nervous system in itself as well. So when we feel threatened or joy, that's expressing itself in the way we use our breath or the way we color our face and things like that as well. So I have no doubt there's more than 5 senses, and the reading you just made just beautifully expresses something we talked about, I think, in our third experiment, where we talked about we're not here to learn what we know, we're here to explore what we don't know.
Yeah.
So I love the build from Mark and Lizzie in the chat. So Mark, I think it's, for me, the way I process it is the order useful, rather than is it a rigid rule. That's how I process it.
Claire says that about models. About some how is it? Some models are useful.
All models are wrong. Some are useful.
That's it. That's it. Right. So
I think there's something about holding everything lightly, isn't there? Mark said hold the sensing lightly, but there is absolutely, but I think there's something about being open to be changed. That's about the partnership that we're talking about in this way of engaging with people.
Yep.
So shall we check in? Where are we now in our experiment? And where do we want to go next? I know that last time, for example, we had some questions last time, and we didn't get to all of them. One of them that I thought was interesting was the one about how do you help people listen like trampolines rather than like sponges. And this, Oscar, you mentioned where this idea comes from.
Yeah, it's sourced from Folkman and Zenger, who touch on in their management consulting practice executive impact, and what they have touched on in some of their research is they've got a research piece that I've quoted in my book around about 4,500 workplace executives and their listening, and the article that this is sourced from, which is a subset of their research, is trying to contrast listening at work versus listening as therapy. So a lot of the article talks about listening is heavy, listening is draining, all these implications of therapeutic listening. But again, just be careful of the false binaries. The sponge versus the trampoline. So the sponge is the therapeutic listening, where you're taking it all in and you're taking it all in and you're taking it all in, but they aren't getting anything back. And the trampoline's about energy and how does it help create height for an idea? How does it create distance for an idea? How does it provide energy for both participants in the dialogue? So I think, again, back to the point I made earlier on, it's not about, is listening like a trampoline correct or incorrect? Is listening like a sponge incorrect or correct? It's in that moment, what does the conversation need to make the progress or not on the contract that we've engaged to have a conversation to? So I think I would recommend, if you get a chance, and we can definitely link it in the show notes, this was eventually became a Harvard Business Review article, but the original research that it was sourced from is about 4,500 listeners, where they make some highly speculative points about gender-based listening, which I can't see the evidence in their research to actually support it.
Interesting. Claire, I saw you go off into dreamland there for a moment. Can you share with us where you went?
Yeah, I did. I went back to the last conversation that we had when we talked about three people and three parts of the conversation. You, me, and the thing. And it made me start thinking about, so where's the sponge? Where's the trampoline? Where's the stuff going? And, what choices do we have about where the stuff is going and how the stuff returns back? Because for me, the purpose of listening deeply is for the other person to be heard, not for me to remember. And one of the things that I notice a lot when I'm working with really experienced coaches, actually listening to recordings, is how easy it is to miss the mood in service of remembering the facts. So if you listen to a piece, and I find working with recordings an extraordinary thing, actually. So you'll listen to a piece and they'll have been live in the room and they'll have picked up on the facts. And when they listen back to the recording and I say, don't forget the facts, because they know the facts. What do you notice about the mood? They almost always they can really notice it. And it's very easy to suddenly go into they're distressed. And I'm going, no, that's a diagnosis. What are you noticing about the mood? It's very quick. It's very high. It's very low. It's very slow. And there's something there about cadence, the pace and the pauses and all those other things. So there's so much in the noticing. And I wonder, and I think now, I think I listen much more to the pace and the sound and visual than I do to the content. Because I think that's where for me, that's where some amazing things can happen.
To me, that sounds less like a trampoline or a sponge and more like kind of a sieve, like collecting the good bits, letting things sort of pass through. It might sound like a bad analogy or a bad metaphor that you're letting things go, but I don't know, what does...
It's helping them hold the sieve and notice what's going through themselves rather than you holding the sieve for them.
So your listening is the sieve for them?
No. They're holding the sieve. The sieve is
Yeah.
the third part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Your job is to be a witness. Your presence will unlock more than any question you ever ask, because it's your presence that's helping them process whatever it is out and into their own sieve. They're holding it themselves, and they're noticing what's staying in and what's going through, and they need to make the meaning from that. If we make the meaning from that, they don't have agency on deciding what to do about it, especially if we're holding the sieve for them. Especially if we're telling them, I have a sieve and I'm gonna pick out the gold for you.
But the gold is, for them, the gold is what they see in the sieve after the things that they know have dropped down, isn't it? I have a question I've been playing around with. I don't like standard questions, but I have got a question I've been playing around with, and it sounds like you've done lots of thinking about this. How do we need to be different today, so that so that's the kind of invitation. And it might be that we need to think about the same thing again. That's fine, but it's an invitation to be different.
Is the we deliberate there, Claire? How do we need to be different?
Yes. Because I think that when we're the three of us, you, me, and the thing, the conversation, then I think we're we. That's true for me. And then when they leave, they're them, and I'm me.
Oscar, do you have a different view on the we? Do you feel that that's inviting you into a space inviting yourself into a space that you shouldn't be in?
The curiosity was about making explicit choices with language, and had Claire considered that, and the answer was definitely yes, because it's in service of that. So yeah, I'm now curious about my choice of when I use we, and how conscious am I of we, because it's rare for me to use it.
Is that connected to it being more of a workplace situation than a coaching situation?
Yeah, I don't distinguish between the two, because they're all in service of a thing to move forward. No, it's just about my consciousness about it's how am I clear that, one, it's not my thing, versus it's definitely their thing, versus a shared thing. Now, don't get me wrong, there are times where I'm winging the conversation, and it's also deliberate and conscious, but I'm just conscious right now of the frequency of the we, and am I holding something right now very hard versus very light, and how can I play with that?
Interesting. As you're talking, I was thinking, in the workplace, would I use we as much as I use we when I'm not going to see anybody between today and next time? And I think I might make different choices, but I need to think about that.
It makes me think about the power differential, and very interesting. Shall we go on to a new question? And I don't see any. Oh my goodness! I apologize.
Good example of the container, Lizzie.
It's my alarm telling me to go to bed. Sorry about that.
Sorry to be keeping you up.
It's quite all right. It's riveting conversation. Shall we? We've got about 15 more minutes, so I would love it if we could make amazing use of that time, and perhaps we can go to one more question. See if we can take a stab at one more question. Okay. How do you offer information and ideas when they are useful and still listen deeply and fully?
I wonder whether we've now got a fourth thing. You, me, the conversation, and the good ideas.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And as I said that, it made me feel, sometimes they can have their equal share at the table, which is where it gets very, very skewed.
Mm.
I think for me, it's a deep noticing about the dialogue between my ego in that moment and how conscious am I. And this requires a lot of practice to get your state right for the conversation that you're in. And you've got to do the work before you get into the conversation to be present enough to notice that duality playing out. Because I have to tell you, like, my ideas are so sexy. It's like when I'm talking to myself about my ideas, oh my God, they are the supermodels of ideas. They have shape and height, and they're spectacular. They're like fireworks, and they're so seductive. And I have to ask myself, is it my idea? Is it a useful idea that's coming through me at the moment because it's in service of the conversation? More often than not, it's just me trying to sound, kind of useful, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that I always think about a couple of heuristics. Is it a useful idea, or is it my ego? Right. That's the first screen. Is now the right time for me even to bring it up?
Mm-hmm.
That's my second screen. And by the time I've got through all of that, they've moved on. And who cares? Right? And I've missed something by not being present because I'm having sex with my own ideas. And that creates nothing because it takes two parties to create something. That's a really bad analogy, Oscar, but that's what was coming to me in the moment.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
Yeah, I have a sense checking question that says, where's this coming from? Is it coming from what I see, hear, and sense? Or is it coming from my preference, opinion, da-da-da-da-da?
Mm.
Do you have sexy ideas, Claire?
I have brilliant ideas. Amazing ideas.
They're brilliant. They're not sexy. Okay.
But there is something, isn't there, that actually, I think for me, there's something about learning that when you wait long enough, often the thing that you were thinking comes out from them much better than it was creating itself in your head.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you see that happen more enough times, for me, that makes me go, well, I don't even bother. Yeah.
But where this shows up in the most unproductive way for me is in the conversation where somebody wants to contract my services as opposed to a coaching conversation. The overwhelming need to be sexy at that part often will repel a subset of potential clients for me. So in the container that is the thing we do about listening, that's easy. But when in minute something's at risk or, there's a reward, wow, sex sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah.
Right.
Poor Mark, he's got no idea. He's laughing his head off right now. I'll be interested in your written reflection on this one, Mark. I can't wait to. Mark and Sue Finch, I'm waiting for your prose.
Yeah, definitely.
So we do have some comments in the chat, and it's hard for me to watch for the comments and try to make sense of them while also listening to the two of you. So let me just have a quick look over there.
Well, this is a really good illustration of the container, Shani. Don't signal to the room that you're going to pause and look at the chat, which should be a signal to the participants to also pause. Don't try and do this real time kind of multitasking thing. It's not going to help you. So just like, okay, there's important input in the chat. We need to pause. So we all pause. So take your time, mate. And we'll still be here.
That's an excellent idea. Thank you for saying that, because I have been trying to keep an eye on the chat, and sometimes the chats are coming in too fast and too furious, and can't get to them. So that's excellent advice. Okay, then let's pause for a moment so I can have a look at the sexy comments that are coming in here. What are the best? So Lizzie says, what are the best context for we versus not we, given the conversation is about two people, to build on the content? That sounds very black and white. It's not meant to be.
I think we played a bit of we versus I ping pong earlier on.
We did, yeah.
I'm suspecting Lizzie asked that question before we dived into it. If we didn't, Lizzie, we will honor you and come back if something's not clear.
Thank you.
There's something for me about the I and we, about being in company versus feeling alone. And I think sometimes we can accidentally isolate the person that we're listening to so that they feel as though we're not really there. And there's something about being present and not being on top of it. Sorry, I'm getting really careful about language now. Okay, let's just leave that one, shall we?
So we have about 6 more
Poor
minutes.
Anya, she can't get the analogy out of her head.
Yeah. So we've got about 6 more minutes. As Claire likes to say, what do we need to do with that 6 minutes to get to where we want to get to today?
Well, just to close it out completely, I do have a confession to make. I did do a keynote in South by Southwest Sydney, which came to Australia 2-3 years ago now. And my talk was, why is listening like comedy and sex? So I do have form in this department.
Do you have a recording of that we can share in the podcast?
I'm afraid not.
Oh.
But because I was listening to the audience, some of the suggestions they came up with is listening and comedy is all about timing.
Yeah.
It's all about listening to the audience. It's all about pacing. And so is sex. It's
and don't try too hard.
Non-verbal feedback. Yep.
Mhm.
Don't try too hard. It was interesting. So we had a speaker briefing, like a speaker kind of canapé thingy drinks.
Mhm.
And I turned to somebody who was another speaker. I said, "What are you speaking on?" And she said, "I'm talking on diversity in the workplace." I said, "Oh, that's fantastic. Tell me more about that." She says, "No, I want to hear about your session." I said, "Oh, it's about listening, comedy, and sex." And she goes, "Sounds like my life. I'm not getting any of all of the above." And I said, "That's way too much information." She said, when you get to my age, there are some things you need and some things you want. And so I think timing. But as we did the Q&A in the session itself, somebody picked up the mic about halfway through, and I don't do Q&A at the end. I always go, just pick up the mic when there's a pause. We'll have the conversation. And she said, if somebody said something really powerful to you, is it okay to use nonverbal language? And I said, "Oh, what will be an example of that?" And no joke, she grabs the mic and goes, "Mm-hmm, uh-huh, mm-hmm." And the whole audience is just cracking up laughing because they've joined the dots between the title and what's going on, and she has no idea. So I have to give her a very deadpan kind of response about nonverbals and all of that. And then about 2 minutes later, she bursts out laughing at the table because somebody explained to her what she'd said. So, yeah.
That's so funny.
I don't think we can top that. Well, shall we wrap up for today on that note?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Can I just notice something?
Please.
When you said, Oscar, that you don't take Q&A at the end,
Mhm.
and you take and people say it, their questions as you're going through. What a beautiful example of timing.
Hmm.
Because at the end, the question's meaningless.
Mhm.
And there's also a very selfish reason why you don't want Q&A at the end. If you're delivering a keynote or a workshop, you want to be deliberate about the energy management and the state of the room and be deliberate about how they exit. And if you hand the mic over to somebody else and they ask a naffed question, it's like people's like, "Get me the hell out of here." And that's all they remember of what was created for the previous 55 minutes. As opposed to if they ask you that question at the 15-minute mark. Great question, Sue. I really appreciate that. When we get to the appropriate moment in our talk, I'm going to refer to your question. And if not, I'll speak to you at the end, kind of thing. And then you're really deliberate about that. But for me, it's always the biggest challenge I have with events. They always want me to do a 45 plus a 15 Q&A, and I say, I don't do that. This is what I do, and it's in service of the audience, not me, because the audience gets more value from their questions than they do from my speech. And consistently, the event organizers after the fact go, "I'm so glad you did Q&A all the way along. I wish more speakers had the courage to take questions," because it's all about being present to the audience, right? It's listening from stage or from your position as a host that's really critical. And I love the way I see Claire do that in some of the videos she's shown about the workshop she does as well.
Thank you. One of the things I learned from doing really big events was if you're out on the floor with Q&A, never let go of the microphone. But that's about timing too, because actually that's about saying once the questions arrived in the flow, the person needs to stop because everything that they say after that is interrupting the flow.
Yep.
Lovely. So, does this conversation continue? Have we said everything we need to say about listening?
I think that's up to the audience, not to us. If they want more, they'll let us know, and if they don't, they'll let us know, and we'll be listening either way.
Perfect. perfect ending. Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Claire, for being with us today. And for the 5th episode in this series, which I've been enjoying very, very much, and I hope everyone else is too.
Well,
Thanks for listening.
yeah, thanks for listening, and thank you, Shani, for the idea.
I'll
Take care,
credit
everybody.
for that.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Fabulous.
Talk about co-creation. Far out. I didn't think I would be getting into procreation. It says the stream is still live, so I'm probably in
I've
trouble.
turned